Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parshas Vayeshev. We're doing Os Tes Vav, that is section 15. And in order to understand this piece in the Zera Shimshon, we need to look at a few psukim. Two of the psukim are in Chumash, and one pasuk is in Sefer Tehillim. So let's take a look at those psukim, and then we will jump right in. And before starting, I want to welcome all of our new participants. Very exciting that we have several new participants tonight. Okay, the first pasuk comes from near the end of our Parsha Vayeshev. It is Perek Mem, pasuk Yud Dalet in Sefer Bereshis. And what's happening here is the famous story of Yosef and the two stewards of Paro. We have the wine steward, the Sar HaMashkim, and we have the baker, the Sar HaOfim. And they have dreams, and Yosef has interpreted the dream of the wine steward, the Sar HaMashkim, and this is what Yosef says to him after he tells him that he's going to be restored to his post. Yosef says to him, to the Sar HaMashkim, Ki im zechartani itcha, if only you will remember me with you, ka'asher yitav loch, when Paro will do good to you, meaning when Paro restores you to your position and takes you out of prison, Yosef says to him, please remember me. Ve'asisa na imadi chased, and you should do with me a kindness. Ve'hiz kartani el Paro, mention me to Paro, ve'hotzeisani min habayis hazeh. And then you'll be able to take me out of this house. This house, of course, was a prison, was, I guess, a euphemistic way of referring to the prison that all of them were held captive in. So Yosef asks the Sar HaMashkim to remember him and to mention him to Paro so that he can be taken out of prison. Of course, we know that the end of the Parsha tells us that Sar HaMashkim did not remember him and forgot about him and did not mention him to Paro, at least not right away. The next pasuk comes from the beginning of the following week's parsha, which is the parsha of Miketz, and the pasuk says as follows: Vayehi Miketz nosayim yomim, and it was at the end of 2 years. Ufaro cholem, and Pharaoh had a dream. Vehine omeid al hayaor, and behold, he was standing on the river. And that pasuk is important because it tells us that 2 years passed before Paro's dreams, and then the Sar HaMashkim, then the wine steward, did remember Yosef and mention him to Paro, and Yosef is whisked out of prison and cleaned up, and he has his opportunity to meet with Paro, and of course the entire story changes from that point on. So those are the two psukim from Chumash that we're going to look at. And now let's take a look at a pasuk in Tehillim. This is Perek Mem, pasuk Hey. And the pasuk says, Ashrei hagever asher som Hashem mivtacho. Praiseworthy is the man who places Hashem as his trust. That means praiseworthy is the person who trusts in Hashem as opposed to anything else. V'lo fana el rehavim, and he does not turn to arrogant people. V'satei chazav, and those who stray after falsehood. That pasuk in Tehillim is going to be central to what the Zera Shimshon is going to teach us tonight. So now let's jump right into the Zera Shimshon, and he says, Os Tes Vav, section 15. Medrash Rabbah. The Medrash Rabbah states, Al pasuk, on the pasuk Vayehi Miketz, it was at the end. So here comes a quote from the Medrash Rabbah, which starts with the pasuk in Tehillim. Ashrei hagever asher sam Hashem mivtacho. Praiseworthy is the man who places Hashem as his trust. Ze Yosef. The Medrash Rabbah says that pasuk in Tehillim, which we read a moment ago, that talks about a person who trusts in Hashem totally, that is a reference to Yosef. And then Medrash Rabbah continues, V'lo fana el rehavim v'satei chazav, and this person who trusts in Hashem does not turn after arrogant people, does not turn to arrogant people and to those who stray after falsehood. So the Medrash Rabbah comments, Al Yedei she'omar l'sar hamashkim, because of the fact that Yosef said to the wine steward, Zechartani v'hizkartani, remember me and mention me, and that of course is also from the first pasuk that we read, Nitosfulo shtei shonim. 2 years were added to the time that Yosef spent in prison, Ad kan Lashono, until here is a quote from the Medrash Rabbah. So this piece in the Medrash Rabbah is telling us that the pasuk in Tehillim that talks about a person who trusts in Hashem and how praiseworthy that person is, Medrash Rabbah says that's a reference to Yosef. And the pasuk that says a person who trusts in Hashem shouldn't turn away to others, to arrogant people, and to people who practice falsehood, that's also teaching us that when Yosef did do that, Yosef put his trust in the Sar Hamashkim and the wine steward, he had to spend 2 more years. The consequence of him doing that was to spend 2 more years in prison. As we saw, Paro only had his dream, which gave him the chance to, which ultimately gave the wine steward a chance to mention Yosef 2 years after the events that occurred at the end of our parsha of Vayeshev. So now let's hear what the Zera Shimshon has to say. Kosha Reishe L'Seife, the beginning of this little piece, this little section of the Medrash Rabbah is a problem. It contradicts L'Seife, the end of the piece. De'im nenash al shebotach b'sar hamashkim, if Yosef was punished because he put his trust in the wine steward, im kain, if so, lo botach b'hakodesh baruch hu, that means he did not put his total trust in Hashem. Umahu zesha omar, and so what did the first part of the Medrash Rabbah mean when it said, Asher sam Hashem mivtacho, this person puts his trust in Hashem, ze Yosef. This is a reference to Yosef. That's the first of the Zera Shimshon's 2 questions that he's going to ask here, and let's just explain that question. The Zera Shimshon is asking that the piece in the Medrash Rabbah seems to be internally contradict itself. Why? Because the first half talks about Yosef as the paradigm, the role model for someone who totally trusts in Hashem. But then the second part turns around and says, well, there is an exception, and that's when Yosef relied on the Sar Hamashkim, the wine steward, and had to spend 2 more years in prison. So the Zera Shimshon says, what's going on? Are we talking about Yosef as the perfect Baal Pitochon, the perfect person who trusts in Hashem? Or are we talking about Yosef, the person who didn't totally trust in Hashem? It seems to be a contradiction. That's his first question. The Od Issa b'Medrash Rabbah, and also there's another piece in the Medrash Rabbah that he wants to mention to us. Sof Parshas Vayeshev. You can see there's actually a double typo here. The word Tzav is in parentheses because it's not correct. And then it says Vayigash, that's also not correct. So it should say Sof Parshas Vayeshev. The Medrash Rabbah at the end of Parshas Vayeshev, Vizel Lashono, and here's a quote from that piece. Mi mechake liyosef. Whoever would have anticipated for Yosef she'ovru alav kol hatzaros ha'elu, that he had to undergo so many tribulations and so many calamities, she'yiyeh melech, that he would ultimately become the king, become second in command and a ruler over Egypt. Ad kan Lashono, until here is a quote from this second piece, second selection from the Medrash Rabbah. V'koshe, and the Zera Shimshon says, this little piece is difficult. Ma ba lelamdenu. What does it come to teach us? Meaning, it's so obvious that it shouldn't even be mentioned by the Medrash Rabbah. Anyone who reads the Chumash, any person who's reading the Chumash, even the most casual reader, even just reading along in Bible stories in English, and they read about how Yosef was sold into slavery by his brothers, and he was taken away from his family, and then he began to establish himself a little bit in the house of Potiphar, and the next thing you know, the wife of Potiphar makes accusations against him, and he's thrown into prison, and it's hopeless, seems to be hopeless for him there. And then the next thing you know in the story is he's brought out of prison, he's showered and shaven and cleaned up, and he's standing in front of Paro, and before you know it, he becomes Paro appoints him to be the second in charge of this great world power, Egypt, Mitzrayim. Anyone who reads that story without any kind of embellishment whatsoever would say, who could have anticipated that? Who could have imagined that? So the Zera Shimshon says, why is the Medrash Rabbah asking that question, or making that point, I should say, about what a surprising turn of events happened to Yosef? That's obvious. Even little children understand that that's such an amazing story and such a surprising ending about what happened to Yosef. So the Zera Shimshon is telling us there must be something deeper that the Medrash Rabbah is teaching us when it says that, and he wants to explain that to us a little later on. So now he's going to begin to give us the information we need to answer the two questions that he asked. However, Amru Zichronom Livracha, the rabbis in Maseches Kiddushin, Chazal in Maseches Kiddushin said, Kol haba davar aveira liyodo, anyone who a matter of sin, a sinful matter, comes to his hand, and we'll explain what that means in a moment, v'nitzol mimenu, and he is rescued from it. So a person has an opportunity to commit a sin, and they refrain from doing so, they're saved from doing so, osim lo nes. And from Shamayim, they arrange for a miracle to occur for this person's benefit. So what the Gemara is talking about over there is not just any Aveira. The Gemara is talking about specifically an act of intercourse, a forbidden act of intercourse. And of course, Yosef would be an example of that, someone who was presented with a forbidden act of intercourse with Potiphar's wife, and he refrained from doing that. And we'll circle back to that point. But the Gemara gives other examples, and it makes a general statement, a rule, a kind of general rule, that if a person is presented with the opportunity to commit such a serious sin as a forbidden act of intercourse, and refrains from doing so, or is rescued in some manner from doing so, that person will have a miracle. The im kain, and if so, Yosef sheba davar aveira liyodo, Yosef, who had such a type of sin temptation presented to him, v'nitzol heimena, and he was saved from it, haya batuach b'Hashem sheyaseh lo nes. He certainly trusted in Hashem that Hashem would do a miracle for him. So Yosef knew this rule of Chazal that was known by Chazal much later, and Yosef knew it much earlier. And so Yosef, of course, trusted that Hashem would do a miracle. Aval lo haya yodea eze nes yihiyeh, but he did not know exactly what the miracle would be. He just knew a miracle is going to happen to me. Hashem's going to do a miracle for me as a reward from refraining from the sin that was presented to me. Hashem's going to do a miracle for me. Ve'af haya batuach, but he was certain, even though he didn't know what the miracle was specifically, he was certain shezeh hanes, that this miracle lo yihiyeh hotza'aso mibeis hasohar levad. It could not merely be that he would get out of prison. We might have thought that Yosef would think, oh, this is fantastic. The miracle will be that I'm going to be released from prison. Zera Shimshon says, no, he did not think that the miracle would be simply to get out of prison. Why not? Shezeh eino nikra nes. Because that would not, in Yosef's mind, that would not have been considered a miracle. Mehatam shepiresh ba'atzmo, from the reason that Yosef himself explained to the Sar Hamashkim, to the wine steward. And now we have a quote from a pasuk from that dialogue between Yosef and the wine steward. Ki gunov gunavti me'eretz ha'ivrim. Yosef said, I have been certainly stolen, kidnapped, me'eretz ha'ivrim, from the land of the Hebrews, v'gam po lo asisi ma'uma, and also here I haven't done anything wrong. So Yosef said to the Sar Hamashkim, the reason, the justification I would like you to mention to Paro is that I'm a completely innocent man. I'm in prison and I'm a completely innocent man. Why? Because even the fact that I originally got sold as a slave wasn't because I did anything wrong. My brothers kidnapped me and sold me into slavery down into Egypt, not because of any fault of my own. And then once I was here and I was working as a servant, I had false accusations made against me, and then I was thrown into a terrible dungeon, a terrible prison. But lo asisi ma'uma, I haven't done anything here in Egypt to deserve being put in prison. So Paro says, please mention those things so Yosef says, please mention those things to Paro. So the Zera Shimshon says that means that in Yosef's mind, it was pure justice that he should be released from prison. Shouldn't take a miracle to release him from prison. It should just take a matter of waiting till the proper authorities understood that he was an innocent man in prison, and they would, of course, release him from prison. That's what Yosef envisioned, and of course, that's what Yosef hoped for in his conversation with the Sar Hamashkim. So that was not the miracle that Yosef expected. Umishum hachi amar hamedrash, and because this was Yosef's perspective, the Medrash says, Ashrei hagever asher sam Hashem mivtacho, praiseworthy is the man who makes Hashem his trust, ze Yosef. Yes, this does refer to Yosef. Shahaya boteach ba'Hashem sheyaseh lo ezen nes, because he did in fact have complete faith in Hashem and trust in Hashem, that Hashem was going to do a miracle for him. Aval afal pi shehaya lo bitachon b'Hashem, but even though he had this trust in Hashem, ta'ah, he made a mistake. Litlos hotza'aso mi beis hasohar, to make dependent his release from the prison. Afal pi she'eno nes, even though he did not view that as a miracle, besar hamashkim, on the wine steward. That was Yosef's mistake. Shahaya lo livtoach b'Hashem, because he should have trusted in Hashem, af al hotza'aso, even on his being released from prison. So let's pause here for a moment. What the Zera Shimshon is saying is that the Medrash Rabbah piece that he brought in the very beginning is kind of ambivalent about Yosef, because it's trying to tell us that Yosef did do something wonderfully correct, but also made a mistake. The fantastic thing that he did is that he trusted in Hashem, and he knew Hashem was going to do a nace for him. The mistake that he made was he thought that's in the realm of miracles, but my release from prison is something that's a matter that could be handled in the regular course of events. It's like you get a ticket for, let's say, speeding, and you want to go before the judge and explain how it was a mistake. It was all a mistake. And you explain to the judge how it was a mistake. He listens to your story and he dismisses the ticket. That's along the lines of what Yosef thought. As soon as the Sar Hamashkim will bring my information about me to Paro and to the proper authorities, they'll say, oh, well, this guy doesn't deserve to be in prison. Let's get him out of there as soon as possible. But Zera Shimshon says the Medrash Rabbah is telling us that was not what Yosef should have been thinking. Yosef should have been thinking, Gam for the nace, also for the miracle, the Gam, and also for the things that could work, so to speak, derech hateva, in a natural way. All of that is dependent upon Hashem. Yosef should have trusted in Hashem for all of that, and that's what the Medrash Rabbah is telling us, as he now explains explicitly in the next paragraph. V'zehu pshat hakosov lefidas hamedrash, and this is the meaning of this pasuk in Tehillim according to the view of the Medrash. Ashrei hagever asher sam Hashem mivtacho, praiseworthy is the man who makes Hashem his trust, ze Yosef. This is a reference to Yosef. He trusted in Hashem. Umnam, however, lios meushar, to be praiseworthy, v'ro'oi lomar bo ashrei, and for it to be fitting to say about a person that he should be praised for his bitachon, to reach the level where David HaMelech is going to say about someone, this is the paradigm, this is the prime example of complete trust in Hashem, tzorech shelo ya'aseh kamo Yosef. Then you have to not make the mistake. You have to learn from Yosef's error and not make that mistake. Shepona el rehavim, because Yosef did turn to the arrogant ones, meaning he did turn to the people he was with in prison and put his faith in this one matter, his release from prison. He put his faith and his trust in them, v'chule, etc. Elo b'chol inyan tzorech sheyiftach b'hakadosh baruch hu. And every matter whether it's a miraculous matter or whether it's a matter that seems to us some kind of natural event, natural occurrence, part of the teva, we have to totally trust in Hashem. Vizehu. And now this can help us understand that second piece in the Medrash Rabbah that seemed to make such an obvious statement that everybody would know it, that it would be unnecessary to say, the statement about who anticipated Yosef becoming the king. Now the Zera Shimshon is going to explain what went on, what's going on with that second piece in the Medrash Rabbah. Vizehu, and this is what it means, mi mechake leYosef, who would have anticipated or expected for Yosef to become the king? Even though Yosef was in fact expecting or anticipating a miracle to happen, because he had been saved, and he had actually saved himself also from committing the sin with Potiphar's wife. But no matter what you want to say he was expecting, he certainly wasn't anticipating being made into the king and the ruler, the second in command, in charge over all of Egypt. That Yosef never could have imagined in his wildest dreams. That's not what he was expecting. Vahainu, and this is Shahoil Sha'anu Roim Sha'avru al Yosef Kol Kach Tsaros. Since we see in the Torah's narrative that Yosef experienced so many calamities, his brothers take him and they kidnap and they throw him in, they want to kill him, but they throw him in a pit, and then he's taken and he's sold down to Egypt. Then he's ultimately put in prison in Egypt. All of these things happened to him. Shma Mina, we learn from these experiences that happened to Yosef, Shechota, that he must have sinned, Behavas Lashon Hara al Echav, when he spoke Lashon Hara, when he told gossip and bad reports about his brothers to his father. And of course, this is brought down in Chumash by Rashi and brought down from the Midrashim and from Chazal, that Yosef, when he was young, a young lad, he would come back to the father and say, I saw my brothers do this and I saw my brothers do that. And then he brought back Lashon Hara about them, saying that they were doing things that they shouldn't have been doing. So the Zera Shimshon says, when the Medrash Rabbah says, that second piece says, because all these things happened, it doesn't just mean, oh, he was in such a bad situation, who could expect him to become a ruler? No. It means because all the bad things happen, it leads us to believe that they must have been consequences and onshin and punishments for the sins that he spoke against, Lashon Hara, against his brothers. That is what we would, that is our way of understanding why these terrible things happened to Yosef. V'shapir avdu echav, and according to that, his brothers did the right thing, shemachruhu le'eved, that they sold him into being an eved. He did a terrible series of averas of speaking Lashon Hara about them. And the Zera Shimshon says, from his punishments, we would lead us to believe that his brothers acted correctly. V'af ki, and even though b'masav hatovim, through his good actions, uv'nisayin shelo, and through all the things he experienced, zocha lehis gadel, he merited to reach a great level. Lo hayalo lios melech. Even so, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't stand to reason that he should have become the ruler, the king over Egypt. Shehu hefech hakenas shel eved, which is the exact opposite of the level of a slave that he had been punished with. So the Zera Shimshon says, the question of the Medrash Rabbah, that second piece that talks about who could have expected Yosef's rise, his amazing rise to power, is asking a deep question. It's asking, from all the terrible things that happened to Yosef, that leads us to believe that he told terrible Lashon Hara about his brothers, and these were punishments for that. And his brothers were justified in getting rid of him and selling him to be an Eved. Once we believe that, then how in the world do we make sense of the fact that when he was let out of prison, instead of just being released from prison and now having kind of living happily ever after, he rises up to unimaginable heights and he becomes the leader over Egypt? How can we understand that? That doesn't make sense. That implies that he must not have done anything wrong, as the Zera Shimshon says. Sha'adar Rabbah, just the opposite. Mizeh, from this fact that he rose to these heights, mashma, it implies shelo chata klal, that he did not sin at all. So the Zera Shimshon expects us to understand something that he doesn't say explicitly, and he also goes on a little bit which we'll get to in a moment. But he expects us to understand that that's the missing piece of the miracle. When Yosef refrained from being with Ashes Potiphar, and he understood the teaching that Chazal bring down in Maseches Kiddushin, that a person who does such a thing deserves a miracle, and he expected a miracle, even though he could not have imagined the miracle would be that he would become the Melech over Mitzrayim, over Egypt. That was the nace, that was the miracle. And that's the point of the second piece in the Medrash Rabbah, to say, after all the things that happened to him, all the sorrows, the problems, the calamities, the terrible misfortunes that happened to him, the terrible experiences that happened to him, after all those things happened, you would think, okay, he did his time. He suffered his punishments, his consequences for the sin of speaking Lashon Hara about his brothers. But now a miracle comes in, and that's the mi mitzapeh. Who could have expected that after those punishments and consequences, he would have the completely unexpected result of being catapulted to this highest conceivable position in the land of Mitzrayim, to become a second in command to Paro. That's the nace, that's the miracle that happened for Yosef, that even he himself did not and could not have seen coming. Now, the last line says as follows, V'ayin od bezeh, and you should see more about this, Beseder Haba, in the Parsha that's coming up, which is Parshas Miketz, after Vayeshev, Al, on the words, Vayar Yaakov ki yesh shever b'Mitzrayim. Yaakov saw that there was grain in Egypt. Of course, that's referring to Yaakov telling his sons, there's a famine in Eretz Canaan. We need to be able to eat. I want you to go down to Egypt and to bring back grain, which of course that led to the brothers meeting up with Yosef and everything that evolved from that. But on that pasuk, the Zera Shimshon says, if you see what I write there, which is Os Yud on Parshas Miketz, you'll see more about this subject. And what the Zera Shimshon says there is fascinating, and so I want to share it with you. He says over there that there is a whole other reason, besides anything we've discussed in this piece in the Zera Shimshon, there's a whole other reason as to why Hashem wanted Yosef to go through these difficult sufferings and these painful experiences, and then to have this incredible rise to power. And the reason for that is because Hashem wanted this to be a symbol for Yosef's descendants, for the Jewish people. And we refer to that as Masa Avos Siman Lebanim. What happens to the patriarchs, what happens to Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, what happens to Yosef, to the Shvatim, this tells us, this is a sign for us as to what's going to happen to Bnei Yisrael. And the Zera Shimshon explains as follows. Hashem wanted Bnei Yisrael to understand that every time, that any time they have an experience of golus, of exile, of pain and suffering and exile, then they need to know that that will always lead for their ultimate benefit. It will always lead to things that are ultimately take them to heights, that will ultimately bring them to heights that they couldn't have imagined before the exile. And that's what happened with Yosef. And what's the first example of that, the Zera Shimshon says? Golus Mitzrayim, Avdus Mitzrayim. The Jewish people are enslaved in Egypt. It's a terrible servitude. They experience terrible, terrible, horrific suffering. And so Hashem wanted them to know and to keep in their minds the idea that just like Yosef was enslaved and suffered, and ultimately he was brought out and rose to incredible prominence and power, so too Bnei Yisrael would ultimately be brought out of Egypt and rise to incredible prestige and power and prominence in a spiritual way. And how did that happen? They're rescued. Yetzias Mitzrayim, Hashem rescues them from slavery, brings them out of slavery, brings them out of bondage. What happens? They receive the Torah, they enter Eretz Yisrael, and the Zera Shimshon says, those are things that only happened, that the Jewish people merited, Bnei Yisrael merited those things to happen for them, to come to Har Sinai and receive the Torah, to then get into Eretz Yisrael and enter the land. They only receive that in the merit of having undergone the experience of Golus. Just like for Yosef, he would not have merited the position in Egypt, his position in Egypt, if he had not undergone the servitude, the Golus from Eretz Canaan, being sent to Egypt, which was a Golus for him, an exile for him, and the suffering that he underwent there. And Hashem wants Bnei Yisrael to always remember that. And certainly for us, we can connect it to the Golus, this incredibly long Golus that the Jewish people have been in since the Churban Bayesheni, the end of the second Beis HaMikdash, and continuing until today. We have to always keep in mind that ultimately it will be for the benefit of the Jewish people. And when the coming of Mashiach comes, we'll see and understand how everything that happens then is a zechus for all of the things that the Jewish people, that Klal Yisrael underwent and during the time of this Golus. Kein Yehi Ratzon, that it should come quickly and soon, b'meheira b'yameinu, and our days.